of my presentation is From True Ownership to Mass Exodus, Exploring Decentralized Intellectual Property. My name is Chris Robison, and I am with Horde, where we enable true ownership within video games through our free and open source SDK. So I've been around the blockchain space since about 2011, and I first started getting really involved in the community in 2012. Over the course of the last year, I've spent a pretty good amount of time participating in, attending, and speaking at different NFT events, including Nifty, which was the first NFT hackathon, and the Non-Fungible Summit put on by the Ethereum Community Fund. And something that I've come to realize and recognize, which I'm sure a lot of you are feeling today or have already experienced, is that the NFT community feels a lot like it did in those early days of Bitcoin in terms of optimism and potential. And I tend to believe that the NFT community, or this decentralized intellectual property group, has the potential to grow to be much larger than the decentralized financial projects that we see in the mainstream blockchain community today. So what I want to do today is sort of continue a conversation that's been going on for the last 7 years or so. So the first thing to observe in this community is that there's a strong theme where we believe that if we truly own the items that are in our virtual experiences, such as the swords in our video games, then somehow it's going to evolve into something that looks like the Oasis, some sort of interesting future that we're not sure what it looks like exactly. And we use a lot of terms to describe what this future could look like. We call it the Oasis, we call it the metaverse, we use the term interoperability a lot, and each one of these terms is really useful for describing a different purpose. The Oasis is good for storytelling, the metaverse is good for diving into more philosophical questions, and interoperability really dives into the technical details. However, I don't believe that any of these terms really justify using blockchain in any of these synthetic worlds. And so what I believe is a really useful term is one that takes on a more of an economic approach. And so I'm borrowing one from virtual economist Edward Castronova, who's done a lot of writing and research into this space, called mass exodus. And Professor Castronova describes this mass exodus as being analogous to something like discovering the new world. It might be a new frontier where people go to discover and explore new opportunities. And in this analogy, of course, the old world is the real world, and the new world that people are leaving to is the virtual world. And there are going to be many of these different synthetic worlds. He expects that the economic impact could reach the scale of where GDP is literally drained out of nation states altogether. So it's important to understand then, if we're looking at this from economic terms, if this actually does happen, why it would be important for someone to go into these virtual worlds, aside from the fact that many of them might be entertaining or fun like a video game. So some of these forces might include job displacement due to artificial intelligence or automation, and there might even be a lack of economic opportunity in the world that people live in today. You can imagine that in many developing nations, a person might be able to generate more wealth for themselves by selling assets inside of a game than by selling fruit on the corner in a street. Physical limitations may also contribute to a mass exodus, whereby a person's environment is not fully suitable to meet all of their needs. And needs in general are a strong economic force, and not just monetary ones. If people are literally flocking into synthetic worlds, and I believe that there will be many of them to compete against each other, it's most likely that the synthetic world that satisfies people's needs the most will be the one that wins. So generally, we need physiological security. We need to feel safe. We want to belong to a community. We want to feel loved. We want to feel a strong sense of self-esteem. And ideally, we want to be able to be self-actualized and express ourselves in honest ways. The interesting thing is that already many of these needs are being outsourced to virtual worlds. And whether we realize it or not, these needs are being commoditized as virtual assets. If, for example, Jody and I are following each other on Twitter, and one day one of us says something that's somewhat controversial and we get deplatformed because of it, then it's going to be very expensive and difficult to replace that virtual relationship. We don't truly own that virtual relationship. And in fact, we don't own many of these virtual assets at all. In fact, every single one of them is a piece of someone else's intellectual property. The only way that we can go into these virtual worlds and extract value from them is by going to the platforms which grant us access to them in the first place. This forced behavior model is completely antithetical to the opt-in future that we're describing in this sort of mass exodus world. So this prompts two questions, and the first one is, what is true ownership anyway? And to be perfectly honest, there's not really that good of a definition. In fact, it appears on somewhat of a spectrum, and this runs along the line of decentralization. So the more decentralized an asset is, the more true ownership people have over that asset. But because of the nature of this industry in particular, I think it's important to recognize that just because a project has blockchain in it does not mean it's actually decentralized. And that means that you might not actually have true ownership of those assets. So for what it's worth, these are the only pieces of infrastructure I would use, which I would consider having true ownership over any assets that reside in them. So they include Bitcoin, Ethereum, Plasma, when it's rooted directly into Ethereum, mainnet, or any of the test nets for testing purposes. Blockstack, which is currently secured by Bitcoin, but is interoperable with Ethereum, and IPFS, which is interoperable with both Ethereum and Blockstack. So just a couple days ago, my team at Horde released a game with true ownership in it called Plasma Dog. We premiered this at ETH Denver, the hackathon that just took place. And the way this works is that each coin that's collected by Plasma Dog is deposited directly into the user's wallet. Additionally, the skins for the character can also be owned as an NFT by the player. So the stack for this game looks like this. The root chain is the Ethereum Rinkeby testnet for now, and the child chain, which is processing the Plasma transactions, is run by Omise Go. Horde is the service provider. Plasma Dog is the game, and the assets in the game are available to anyone who goes ahead and plays it. So simply put, the assets in the game are secured by Ethereum, and they have true ownership. The second question is once we have true ownership, how do we get to mass exodus? And this also does not have an entirely clear answer, but it does involve us creating new business models together. So games are not going to look exactly like games, and I think we're pretty well aware of that, but what do they look like? And this sort of falls into that realm of decentralized intellectual property that I believe is going to emerge. And so what I want to exemplify is a model that we're working on at Horde, which is that exchanges aren't necessarily like just a set of buy and sell orders. They're a lot more complicated than that. And we see this emerge with protocols like 0x, where exchanges are actually relayers for a pool of assets. So we see in the decentralized financial movement, non-custodial relayers, and this is a very common model where tokens are minted on Ethereum, and anyone can truly own these. They're fully autonomous assets. The decentralized exchange never ends up holding any of the virtual assets. They just facilitate the exchange, and they compete against each other merely based on user experience. So whichever user experience is better, you can expect that that exchange is going to be able to generate more revenue. So at Horde, we believe that this is basically going to look the same, that games are going to serve a similar purpose as a relayer. The assets in the game are from completely separate entities, potentially, and the game serves as a relayer just for the experience for the player. So similar to how relayers on decentralized exchanges compete for the best user experience, whatever is going to be the easiest, similarly, we're going to see that games in this space are going to compete on the level of being whatever's the most fun for the players. So in other words, whichever virtual experience satisfies players' needs the most will win. And I believe this type of model can be extrapolated to all types of synthetic worlds, and that the more we design these types of opt-in systems, the more likely a success there will be at having something that looks like a mass exodus. So thank you very much. It is now with not without irony that I ask you to please follow us on Twitter at Horde Exchange and me at CBob Robison. And if there are any questions about mass exodus or true ownership. What do I mean by mass exodus? So by mass exodus, I mean that people will probably be, like, these virtual worlds will end up competing for our attention in a very direct way against the real world. So we'll be spending more of our time in them, we'll be developing more of our relationships in these virtual worlds, and we'll probably be generating a lot more wealth. And again, like, wealth doesn't just involve money, it involves relationships, like how you manage the relationships with each other, how you keep up with your friends. And so that's really what I mean by mass exodus, and what's outlined in an awesome book, which is Exodus to the Virtual World by Edward Castronova, if anyone wants to check that out. Yeah. Sweet. All right. Well, thank you so much.